Corcoran's Secret History, the prison where gladiator fights really happened. Before we dive into the darkness behind these walls, make sure you hit that subscribe button, tap like, and drop a comment. Because the truth we uncovering tonight isn't meant for the faint-hearted. The desert sun was already falling when the first alarm blared across Corcoran State Prison. A sound so sharp, so violently urgent, it sliced through the silence like a blade. Officers surged toward Facility 4B, the notorious maximum security unit where California housed some of its most dangerous inmates. But tonight wasn't another routine disturbance. This time, an inmate lay bleeding on the concrete, motionless, while another stood over him, shaking, terrified, as if he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. Before the cameras cut out, before the reports were sealed, something else happened in that yard, something no one wanted to explain. But before we continue, before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Officer Daniel Ruiz was the first to step through the sally port. He'd worked at Corcoran for more than a decade, and he knew the feel of a normal yard fight. Quick, explosive, brutal. But this wasn't that. The inmates weren't scattered. They weren't running. They were pressed against the fences, watching with an eerie stillness. As Ruiz scanned the yard, he felt that familiar tightening in his chest. Something had been staged here. Something wrong. The medical team rushed in, lifting the unconscious inmate onto a stretcher. His name, Terrence Barlow, a known gang affiliate, but also a man who'd been keeping to himself for months. The inmate who attacked him, Miguel Ortiz, looked almost dazed, as if he didn't fully understand what he'd done. Ruiz noticed the guards exchanging glances, silent signals that only longtime officers understood. He had seen that look before, during the years when Corcoran's darkest chapters still whispered through the hallways. The years of the so-called gladiator fights. Those were the days when inmates from rival gangs were quietly placed together in the yard, then shot at when the inevitable violence erupted. Official records called it yard management. Rumors among inmates called it something else, a game, a spectacle, a bloodsport orchestrated by those in charge. The scandals had supposedly ended in the late 1990s. But Ruiz had always known the truth. Shadows that deep don't just vanish. They sink, settle, and wait. Detective Laura Vega arrived that same evening from Kings County, assigned to investigate the assault after the prison's story didn't add up. She'd been a corrections investigator for years and had walked into more cover-ups than she cared to admit. When she saw the yard footage, she froze. The angles were too perfect. The cameras that should have caught the start of the fight were conveniently offline. And Ortiz's expression, the fear, the confusion, suggested a man who'd been pushed into something he never wanted. Then came the first red flag. The shift logs were incomplete. Whole minutes missing. Officers claiming they didn't see the start of the altercation. And an anonymous envelope slid under Vega's hotel door containing only one sentence. Check the file they buried in 4B. The next morning, Vega asked for access to the housing unit archives. The staff hesitated, stalled, claimed the request needed approval from higher-ups. She pushed harder. Hours later, she finally stepped into the dim records room of Facility 4B. Dusty boxes, redacted reports, misfiled forms. But then she saw it. An old, unmarked folder wedged between misshelved logs. Inside were photos, yard layouts, names of inmates long transferred or deceased, notes scribbled in handwriting she didn't recognize. And at the bottom, a sheet labeled simply, Programmed Events, Review Only. Her stomach tightened. The dates were recent, far more recent than any scandal should have been. And then she saw the last entry, dated only 3 weeks earlier, with 2 names circled, Terrence Barlow, Miguel Ortiz. Her hands shook. Someone had planned this fight, and someone wanted Vega to find out. But before she could turn the page, the lights flickered, then shut off completely. A door clicked behind her, and footsteps entered the room. The deeper investigators dug into California's prison system, the more they realized Pelican Bay was only the beginning. Beneath the surface of California's correctional network lay institutions far older, more chaotic, and more violent. Places where history, gangs, and desperation collided in ways that even veteran officers struggled to describe. Chapter 2 begins with the facility that officers quietly say they fear more than Pelican Bay, California State Prison, Sacramento, better known as New Folsom. The first thing investigators learned was that New Folsom didn't need isolation units to be dangerous. Violence lived in the open daylight. Officers described a place where every inmate movement felt like a test of control, where one wrong glance could turn a quiet yard into a battlefield. In 2015, that fear became reality when a routine yard program exploded into an all-out riot. Dozens of inmates rushed each other with sharpened steel, while officers fired warning shots from towers and alarms screamed across the compound. The footage from that day was so chaotic that investigators replayed it dozens of times and still couldn't determine what sparked it. All they knew was that the violence was instantaneous, organized, brutal, and impossible to predict. Some officers later admitted that Pelican Bay's SHU felt safer in comparison because at least you knew where the danger was coming from. But New Folsom wasn't the only nightmare on their list. 2 hours south, near the quiet farmlands of Monterey County, sat Salinas Valley State Prison, a place inmates whispered about with a different kind of fear. This wasn't a prison of silence like Pelican Bay. It was a pressure cooker. Investigators reading through years of reports found pages filled with ambushes, gang-driven assaults, and coordinated attacks that erupted without warning. The prison's design, tight walkways, blind corners, and yards cut into multiple zones, allowed violence to happen faster than staff could respond. One report stood out. In 2018, an officer on routine patrol was suddenly surrounded and stabbed multiple times in an attack investigators later confirmed was gang-directed. The assault was so precise and silent that other officers didn't realize what had happened until the wounded officer stumbled back toward the control booth. That single incident reshaped how investigators viewed Salinas Valley. Pelican Bay isolated gang leaders. Salinas Valley forced them to coexist, negotiate, and fight, all in the same violent environment. But nothing on their list carried a darker shadow than the prison in Kings County, Corcoran. Every investigator knew its history. In the 1990s, Corcoran became the center of one of the biggest scandals in California corrections. Officers were accused of placing rival gang members on the same yard, knowing violence would erupt, and multiple inmates were shot and killed during what later became known as Gladiator-style incidents. The scandal triggered years of federal oversight, lawsuits, and national shame. Even decades later, investigators said walking through Corcoran felt like stepping into a building that never forgot its past. What unsettled them even more was how the violence didn't stop with the scandal. Corcoran's segregation units still housed some of California's most volatile inmates, men responsible for riots, assaults, and decades of gang warfare. Officers who worked there told investigators that the air felt thick, like every step carried the weight of old grudges and unfinished business. Some said they trusted the walls of Pelican Bay more than the yards of Corcoran, because Corcoran's violence was unpredictable, rooted in history the system never fully confronted. By the time investigators finished reviewing the reports, interviews, and archived footage, one thing became clear. Pelican Bay wasn't California's lone nightmare. It was one of many, and some prisons hid dangers far more unpredictable. The truth was unsettling, and as Chapter 2 closed, investigators found themselves facing a darker realization. The worst facility on their list was still ahead. By the time investigators reached the final prison on their list, they expected chaos, danger, and violence. But nothing prepared them for what they found at California State Prison, Los Angeles County, better known as Lancaster. This wasn't just another dangerous facility. This was the one officers quietly ranked as the most unpredictable, the most volatile, and the most psychologically disturbing in the entire state. It didn't have Pelican Bay's isolation or Corcoran's infamous scandals. Instead, it had something worse, a level of instability that made every day feel like the start of a riot no one could stop. The investigation began with an incident from 2021 that officers still refused to speak about openly. A seemingly routine morning turned into a nightmare when two inmates, both previously classified as low risk, suddenly attacked their cellmate during breakfast release. There were no prior warnings, no gang orders, no documented disputes. The violence was so sudden and frenzied that investigators described the scene as pure chaos in a place already built for chaos. It was the kind of incident that shouldn't have happened. And yet at Lancaster, it wasn't even the worst one that year. As investigators combed through the facility, they saw what officers meant by instability. Lancaster housed a large population of inmates with severe mental health needs, and combining that with gang tensions created an environment where violence didn't follow predictable patterns. It could spark anywhere: the yard, the day room, a medical line, even during programs that were supposed to reduce conflict. That unpredictability terrified both staff and inmates. Pelican Bay operated on control. Lancaster operated on uncertainty. One officer explained it like this: in Pelican Bay, you know who wants to hurt you. In Lancaster, you don't know until it's already happening. Investigators felt the truth of that sentence as they walked through housing units where tension hovered in the air like static electricity. Every door echoed too loudly. Every conversation felt like someone listening. The environment was overwhelming emotionally and psychologically, in a way that Pelican Bay's silence never was. But the case that changed everything came from a security camera pulled from one of Lancaster's outer yards. The footage began like any normal day. Inmates walking laps, others talking near the fence, officers stationed along the perimeter. Then, without warning, a single inmate sprinted across the yard toward a group of rivals. Officers yelled for everyone to get down, alarms blared, and bodies scattered in every direction. What looked like a spontaneous attack quickly spiraled into a full-scale yard riot. Dozens of inmates joined in without clear alliances, like the violence itself had taken over. When investigators reviewed the tape frame by frame, they realized something chilling. This wasn't coordinated. It wasn't planned. It was an eruption of pressure that had been building far beneath the surface. Lancaster wasn't the worst because it was the bloodiest or the most infamous. It was the worst because it was the most unpredictable. In prisons like Pelican Bay, danger had structure. In Corcoran, danger had a history. But in Lancaster, danger had no rules at all. It could come from anyone, at any moment, for reasons no one could foresee. That kind of environment didn't just wear people down, it broke them. As investigators closed their files, they realized the truth the public rarely hears. California doesn't have one dangerous prison. It has many, each with its own brand of chaos, its own hidden history, its own scars that don't make headlines. Pelican Bay may be the most famous, but fame doesn't measure fear. Those who worked behind the walls know the reality. Sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones nobody talks about. And if you're watching this and you think this story was intense, just imagine the ones we haven't uncovered yet. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, what story you want next, hit like, subscribe, and brace yourself, because the next one might be even darker.